There's a flow to history and culture. That flow is rooted in the way people think about God, because the way they think about God will determine everything else about them. We are doing our best to communicate our story to a world of people who exist on the internet. And in order to do that, you kind of have to hook people. You kind of got to go, hey, this is why it's important to listen. And so I think that probably just jumping into Jordan Peterson is maybe a better way to do that, just because Pete and Sam, nobody knows Pete and Sam.
He is the man of the moment.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson, he carries a little bit more weight to that. But I think that I would still like to do a little bit of an introduction for you and I, and help people kind of locate why we're having this conversation. Where you're coming from, where I'm coming from. We both went to the same university, and we both have a passion for classical works. So
well, and I think now we're like behind the curtain. It's behind the curtain, but
great.
In communicating truths to the internet world, having conversations that are rooted or being had by real people who know each other is maybe some of the antidote to the dark side of doing all of your thinking on the internet, you know.
I hope so.
Yeah, so those kinds of personal introduction. Hey, small town, but your small town was bigger than my small town. You know, like that's still important for because we're communicating with people about this world we live in.
Well, yeah, and I think antidote is a good word, right? Because and this goes into the classical imagination and the need for the classical imagination. Socrates, looking at the city, says that the city is like zooming in on the soul of humanity. It's harder to diagnose the problem if I'm just looking within myself, and I don't have a community of people around me to help me. Are you
I just
gathering
didn't
your
like
icons?
thing.
Oh, okay. I thought you had
no, but
I thought you had something to show and tell.
My little floor lamp just
good.
stick there. I'm like, I don't want to.
Okay. So I wonder, thinking about Socrates and how he points to the city and says, hey, let's look at the city so that we can diagnose the problem of humanity. I think in a way we're in a world where we can just look at the internet. So
that's our city now.
If the city was the soul writ large, and we're zooming in on the soul of humanity by looking at the city, is maybe the internet even a closer up picture, like a bigger zoomed in picture than even Socrates got by looking at the city, because we're looking at the world. Like, we're not just looking at Athens.
Cities have gotten bigger. And this is the biggest one. Yeah.
This is the biggest one, right? And within that, there is a sense of being dislocated from one another. We're losing the dialogues. We've lost sort of the classical imagination, the ability to have dialogue. And so you, Sam, and me, Pete, we know each other. We come from the same town, and then we went to the same university at different times. And that was online, of course.
Yeah.
So that's
which means we are uniquely qualified for this particular cultural moment.
Right. Exactly. Yes. We have no idea what it's like to carry on a conversation in a classroom, in person.
Never done it.
Only ever done it online. So here we go. Do you want to share just a little bit about how I talked you into going to Knox, maybe?
Yeah. That would be a fine thing to do.
Because, and again, and I'm not sure how we will put these together. Like I said, this is part of the introduction. We will probably start with Jordan Peterson. So if you're watching this now and you're like, what are these guys talking about? We're going to jump into Jordan Peterson, but we're actually doing the introductions first, even though they might come later. And the other thing that will come later, if that's not terribly confusing, is a little bit from Knox, a little bit of Steve Jack's introduction to the Master of Arts in Christian and Classical Studies program. So, yeah, we get to be joined by Steve in a little while.
Yeah. When you were still living in California, I don't think we had a good reason to meet except that we wanted to hang out over coffee that one time. And I had already been looking at seminaries knowing that I am happiest when I'm studying things.
Mm.
And then it just happened that you had, I think you had just finished
Yeah.
this program at Knox. But you said it in kind of offhanded way, like, yeah, they had, we read this and that. I'm like, I didn't know you could read any of those books at a seminary. I thought you did textbooks.
Right.
And that was the draw, or that you were reading books that I wanted to read with people that knew those books already. And I didn't know that that could exist in actual higher education.
Right.
And then looking at the program, I was pretty well sold. But
Which is crazy that we've lost that. We have
Right.
lost that. This is what education used to be.
Yeah.
And yet most people going to university don't get this education. They don't get a classical education.
No.
They're not introduced to the great conversation. Yeah. So I've actually got Knox here pulled up. Not that one. Here it is.
I think the one, is it a video or is it there it is.
No, this
is
is
yeah.
just
Yeah, with the books.
I mean, these are
the list of this is what did it. This is what sold it for me right here.
You think to yourself, well, and I mean, what was the draw there for you? What did you feel like there was something missing that said, "Hey, I need to go back and read this. I need Sophocles in my life. I need Aristophanes." What is an Aristophanes? I don't even know, but I just know that I
don't
need
know how
it.
to Aristophanes. There's a couple specific works that I'm like, oh, this has to be it. And one I had read or attempted to read a couple of these things. Paradise Lost was one, and Confessions of St. Augustine was another. Where like I had read it, and like there's bits and pieces that I knew I was getting, but I knew I was not. I was in the deep end and had no business being there, essentially, by myself, because I don't think these books are meant to be read by myself. And then I just have certain ideas about them. I'm like, well, I like this one. I didn't like that one. That didn't feel like I was engaging with the material. And then I had read, all right, I actually listened to it as an audiobook, full disclosure, the Brothers Karamazov, maybe a year before we had talked. And I knew, having read it, I'm like, that was probably the most important piece of fiction that I've read.
Yeah.
Someone needs to tell me why. Why did it do this?
Yes.
Well, and that was at the time that was the capstone book. That the last class you took in the program was Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. And you had to kind of synthesize that stuff. But
I'm not seeing Brothers Karamazov on this list, however.
Nope,
I'm assuming it's
changed a little bit.
Please tell me that's still part of the program, though.
Well, I don't know, because I was the last class kind of the former program before kind of a remodel.
The previous way the course was designed, which I think is brilliant, which takes us back to this great conversation, which takes us back to the need for dialogue, which kind of takes me back to this channel and why this channel started, which is when you do need a guide. If you're going to go through Dante, you want a community of people. If you're reading Dante in isolation and you don't have either someone to guide you through, like literally, and that's a great example, right? Because Dante himself has Virgil guiding him.
Yeah.
The reason he has Virgil guiding him is that you need guides in life. And so Dante's guide is Virgil. My guide might be Dante, and these others, hopefully it's Jesus, as well. But he's the
one. Yeah.
He's the one. Yeah. And we'll get to that. This is why the Jordan Peterson clip is important, because he talks about how the Bible is the foundational. He uses the word foundational. We would talk in classical terms maybe and say that it is the story from which all other stories come from and derive their meaning. The classics are classics because they inform the soul through history, and they can become kind of eternal in that sense. They're not just speaking to a particular time or culture; they're speaking broadly and universally into the human experience.
There's transcendence. Yeah. There's a transcendence in the classics that is recognizable by multiple generations throughout time and space.
Yeah, and I think
self-evident in a way.
I think we're seeing a great need for that. More and more people are longing for what you just described. I read this book. It changed my life. Please tell me why.
Yeah.
please.
Well,
please
and it can happen in the other direction too, because I've read like some classics, and I ended it and I'm like, I did not like that book. I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't think the guy that I was supposed to like was likable or whatever.
Yeah.
And I still want someone to explain it, because like, I'm going to assume I'm wrong. Like, people have been saying this is excellent for a long time before I got to it. And I certainly don't have the authority to say, well, that's not a good book. But I do want to engage. I want to enter into the larger conversation that was going on before the author wrote the book, to understand like why am I affected in any way by this story?
Yeah.
And maybe where am I lacking even in being the guy who's like, well, that was a lame book. I didn't like it.
I wonder what you think about this. I've always felt like, so within the great conversation, there is almost an argument between poetry and philosophy.
Yes.
And that's shown with Socrates and Aristophanes. Aristophanes writes these plays that are mocking Socrates.
This grand rivalry.
Yeah. And then of course Aristophanes is the one that gets Socrates arrested and killed, and eventually right? I mean, that's
those poets. You got to watch out for those poets, man.
So
they'll do you in.
So this argument has very real stakes. The stakes are high, the consequences are high, the ideas have consequences. And it's so funny to me when I think about Aristophanes, because he wrote Clouds, which is Socrates having these conversations in the clouds, right? He's up in the sky. He's not in real life.
His feet are not touching the ground.
His feet are not touching the ground. What are we doing right now? I mean, we're having a conversation in the clouds. Like, that's what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Like, Aristophanes wasn't wrong. He was just early.
He was just early. Yeah.
And so there's this philosophy and poetry argument going on. There's also algebra and geometry. This is kind of how I think about it sometimes.
Okay.
Why is it that this classic work hits me, speaks to my soul, where this other one doesn't? I found this to be true with Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine speaks to me. Aquinas, I'm kind of like, it's interesting. It's kind of boring. Yeah.
Well, there's a comparison I've heard by someone saying that Aquinas or Augustine is beautiful in the sense that a song or a poem or a flower is beautiful, and Aquinas is beautiful like the instructions to a complicated board game.
Right.
And you're like, that's not beautiful to me. It's like, no, it is. It is.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Like that. Yeah. It's like, okay. All right.
I would say that, like,
very different.
Yeah. It's almost like, Augustine is painting with words, let's say, and Aquinas is building with words. Is that?
Oh, that's good.
Like he's building a structure. Whereas Augustine, and Socrates to some degree, because maybe Socrates and Aristotle are a better comparison here. And hopefully I didn't miss this up, but I was thinking Socrates has informed Augustine.
Sure.
Aristotle informed Aquinas, and so there's that kind of algebra and geometry going on. And maybe I'm missing, like maybe that's.
And even just that's like the forms and specifics.
Yeah.
The ideal
universals and particulars.
Particulars. Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons why a particular classic might not hit you or me, or they might just hit differently, is that I'm far more happy doing geometry. I'm far more happy sort of like reading a poem or painting a picture than I am doing like architecture or algebra. If that makes sense. So that's why I always put Aquinas and Aristotle in that kind of architecture and algebra sphere, and then poetry and kind of art is more maybe Socrates and Augustine. But maybe, I don't know if that helps. if you're like, oh man, I'm reading this book, it's just, I'm not getting it. It's probably because you're thinking geometry and it's algebra, or vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
So, anything else, like how has, I don't know, anything else that has stood out from you from that program, or just even the classic conversation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we both agreed, like, it was excellent. It was great. So glad I did it. But then you say, like, I did this program, or I got this degree. But really you just entered into a conversation. You entered into
Yeah.
a worldview. That's a phrase that was, thrown around for a long time. That you realize, like, everything I'm reading now, everything I'm listening to, the things I'm watching, the clips like that we're going to watch shortly, these things are now filtered through this conversation that has been going on for a long time. And you feel, when I feel like I'm beginning, I'm in the beginning stages of engaging with, like, I haven't read everything, that any of these, masters have written or anything like that. But I am at the starting line where I'm beginning to see the world through these lenses of that I realize, like, I'm the odd man out. Like, novelists, artists, painters, philosophers, poets have been seeing the world this way for a very long time. And not just people, but, like, the church has been seeing the world through these ways. And it's like, I don't have to invent this, but I do have to discover it. And so that's been kind of just a shift in my thinking, the way I observe things.
And do you feel like, in a way, as a pastor, you can engage in that conversation? There's sort of I don't know, maybe an art form to preaching that it's part of engaging with that conversation.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I do have an opportunity, maybe more than others, because I am speaking eternal truths.
Yeah.
You might say professionally.
Yeah.
A few times a week, but it was difficult. I think it's still difficult sometimes, because there's not very many conversations that you find yourself in day to day that you have to convince the people that you are having a conversation. Like, you don't have to tell someone, like, no, do you know what we're talking about? They're like, yes, I'm talking with you.
Yeah.
So
I
there's
see
some,
that.
like, remedial work that I had to go through, and that takes some doing, just in bringing a congregation or individuals in the congregation to say, hey, this is.
Okay.
We have the churchy lines, hey, there's nothing new under the sun. And that's an to say, like, this has been talked about a lot of ways in a lot of different ages, and here's how you can see some of these truths in their primordial form, and then they're coming through scripture, and they're coming through the church history, and now here you go.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if I did that well.
It does, because what you were saying about the program is it's not just a college degree. It's an invitation into a conversation that's been going on. And I think, to me, that's beautiful, because I never wanted to just get a diploma. I never wanted to just check a box. I wanted an education. I wanted to feel like I could be conversant with exactly what you're talking about. I see these themes going on, whether it be in movies or TV shows or books that I'm picking up. Maybe C.S. Lewis was one of the first ones that clued me into the fact that I'm missing something. Like, he's having a conversation with a whole world that I've never been introduced into. And so I think that that's great. I think anybody that's looking for an actual education should be looking at something like this, that's more classically generated. And then realizing that what you're doing is inviting a congregation into that into that conversation. So just as your degree was an invitation into it, now you are, and this is Plato's cave, right? You are you don't just bask in this beatific vision of the outer world and the stars and the sun and all that. No, you realize, oh, I need to go explain this to the people in the cave. That sounds really like
Yeah.
bad, like we're treating people like they're ignorant or whatever. And that's not the intent. That's not the heart behind it.
No.
But I think the reason Sam and I both went to this program is acknowledging that we were missing
Mm-hmm.
something. And I think a lot of people are missing something. I think that we have this clip from Roger and Louise Perry, and she clues into that. She's like, there's a lot of young people who
Yeah.
are craving this, and they may not even know what it is, because
Right.
our modern approach has been to say we don't need those old stories anymore. We have advanced beyond that. We've mastered those things, and we need not open those books again. That's old news. That's old information. And yet, and I wonder, and this could be a good segue into that Jordan Peterson video,
Yeah.
or a good way to connect that Jordan Peterson video, which is it possible that people like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, Russel Brand, some of these other people that are speaking with very kind of loud, prominent voices in culture are touching on some of that classical conversation? Maybe they realize it to some degree. Maybe they don't. I think I really do think to some degree, like particularly I've heard things from Russell, maybe a little bit from Joe Rogan, certainly from Jordan Peterson, that it's like, yeah, no, we are engaging in that conversation.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, I don't think it gets enough acknowledgement during the podcast or during whatever interview they might be going on, because of what you just said. It's hard to have a conversation with people and then try to explain, do you see what we're doing here?
This is the conversation we're having.
We're talking, we're pulling from Aquinas and Augustine, and we're pulling from all these,
well, and that's really important too, just in the, for two reasons. One is like, if they're not aware of the conversation that they're in, they're still in it.
Right.
And then if they're not, and this goes for like pastoral ministry too, like if I am not expressly saying, this is how, Plato leads to Augustine, which leads to Aquinas, which leads, it's like, you don't want to be name dropping, it's not like name dropping, like all these, it's like, no, I don't need to do that. What I need to do is glean from these things and then introduce it to, a specific given audience.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like if you have to explain the joke, it's not funny. If you have to explain what you're saying, maybe you've wandered off a little bit too much, or you're just becoming one of those, I have many leather bound books, my library smells of rich mahogany. Look how educated I am. And I think that is a danger to some degree with a classical education, with reading classical works, is that because you do become, it's almost like you're behind the scenes. It's almost like you've gotten a backstage pass. You see what's going on. We can even see what's going on politically. Like, I think there's so much there's like, well, duh. Like, it's not a surprise. This is not news. It's old news happening to new people. There's a trajectory, and yet at the same time realizing that although you feel in some ways like you've gotten out of the cave and you see the world more clearly and more accurately for what it is, there is a sense that, if you are going back down into that cave to have dialogue with people, hoping that they then come out of the cave, again, that sounds very arrogant, but you realize that, no, those people need to be a part of this conversation. We're missing something because you're not a part of the conversation, because you haven't read this book, and I'm missing you as a part of, as an interlocutor, as a person to have dialogue with. And so it's not like, oh, I'm an elite and I have all this knowledge and now I'm going to go rescue these ignorant people. It's that the classical education, or this classical imagination that we're talking about, motivates you in a way that, I don't know, maybe we're touching on something of the gospel here. Like, I came to know Jesus, and it didn't make me feel like I became an elite person. I just was like, it was like I was apprehended by this person, Jesus. And then I looked around at my friends and realized, guys, there's a whole part of life that you're missing. Like, you're missing it, and and I am sad by that. Like I want you to see what I see now. And
Yeah.
so then you become an evangelist, right?
Yep.
You're not motivated by your own, whatever, self-aggrandizement, but you're motivated because you see how important that person is and how much they would benefit by being a part of this conversation, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Well, because since the conversation isn't about only things in the clouds, which is kind of the
Yeah.
accusation,
Yeah.
right, from Aristophanes, but it's like, no, this is about people,
Yeah.
and it's about the city
Mm-hmm.
and opposing cities, city of God, city of man. It's
Mm.
about how we live with each other. It's like it doesn't take too long to make it not just like applicable sometimes,
Yeah.
but like holistically
Yeah.
infiltrating every relationship, every kind of
Mm.
um, vocation, which again, it's like what you want is an education, which is like,
Mm.
how should I live in the world?
Mm-hmm.
How now should man live?
Mm. Yes.
That's what I want to know. Tell me when you figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you got to read Schaeffer's book,
Yeah.
right?
That's right. That's right.
Literally,
That's
it's
it.
called "How Should We Then
Yeah,
Live."
yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, that's a funny thing about just going back to Knox too. I think one of the things that you said attracted you to that is they had like a
Yeah.
Francis Schaeffer scholarship. And
Yep.
I don't know about you, but I didn't read a single Francis Schaeffer book the
It's
entire
true.
time
It's true.
there. But it's a tip of the hat to Francis Schaeffer.
It
So.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a nod, an homage.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think also one of the funny things about maybe Knox in particular and the classical education when it comes to evangelical Christianity is that it does kind of create some black sheep. And
Yeah.
so, yes, they started
Yeah.
this program with a Francis A. Schaeffer scholarship, not because they were reading a bunch of Schaeffer books, but because they hoped to do maybe what Schaeffer did, which is,
Yeah. And it had been a while since it had been done.
yeah, but also,
Yeah.
but Schaeffer is kind of like one of those people who is looked at maybe from an evangelical, maybe just like I don't want to call it like just like a normie evangelical church Christianity. If they even know about Schaeffer, he's a little bit of an oddity.
Right.
He's up in the Swiss Alps. He's wearing funny clothes. He uses non-church language, and I think that's one of the things where Schaeffer, and this is a beautiful thing again about a classical imagination and about being an evangelist. Maybe is that I don't speak church language. I don't speak Christianese because that's not my calling. I mean, in a way, like we're both working in church ministry, so we equip the church. We're building up the body, equipping the saints and all that. But if I'm going to share my story with people who have never been to church, they don't know who Jesus is, they've never read the Bible, or, classical, if it's a part of a classical conversation, maybe they've never read Dante. I can't use the church language. And Schaeffer had a way of doing that. He talked to people in a way that they could understand it. He used maybe he didn't use their definitions, but in defining his own terms, used their own language, maybe is a way of saying it.
Well, and what was and is so beautiful with his stuff is that he uses language that is accessible.
Yeah.
And no one could possibly accuse him of talking down to people,
right,
or dumbing down the conversation. I mean, he's talking about, top shelf stuff.
Yeah.
History, philosophy, church history, especially, like all this stuff. And so it wasn't like, oh, like I'm going to come down from my pedestal or down from the clouds and like you uneducated people can now know about Jesus. And like, here you go. It's like, no, he's lifting you up to this conversation that you realize, like, I've had an appetite for this.
Yeah.
And now you're giving me the bite-sized pieces of it.
Yeah. Well, and one of his maybe famous lines, I guess you could say, is that there's a flow to history and culture, and that flow is rooted in the way people think. I always try to mash that up with what A.W. Tozer said, which is what comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. It'll determine how you live. That's kind of a paraphrase, but it's like there's a flow to history and culture. That flow is rooted in the way people think about God, because the way they think about God will determine everything else about them. And that's why, at least for me, that's one of the things that gave me a hunger for exploring the classics, understanding that flow to history and culture, so that, because I work in youth ministry,
Mm-hmm.
so that I can prepare young people, not for today, but for the world
Mm-hmm.
that they will inherit as adults. So I
A
have to
build.
be like a Schaefer to try to anticipate where culture is going. And if I can if I can understand where culture has come from, I can try to
Yeah.
understand where culture is going, and we can be better equipped as Christians, as disciplers,
Yeah.
as followers of Jesus, to be evangelistic in that world.
Yeah. Well, and how important to recognize too that our interest in knowing the culture, which I don't think we've shied away in modern, if you want to say, the normative evangelical culture. Like there's
Yeah,
conferences every year about like,
yeah,
oh, like you have to know the culture because you got to reach the culture with the
right,
gospel, and there's
right,
timeless truth, and there's
yeah,
today.
yeah,
But it's like, well, but it's not today. Like culture didn't
yeah,
start today,
yeah,
and the next generation,
yeah,
like Gen Alpha, like
yeah.
didn't start in whatever year they were born in. Like
Yeah,
culture began a long time ago.
yeah,
This is how you're going to be able to apply the gospel to culture, because
yeah,
it's been happening. It's been
yeah.
building up to this point.
Gen Alpha is
Yeah.
the product of the generations that have come before them. They
Right.
didn't
Right.
appear. They didn't show up in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm. Spontaneous
Yeah,
generation.
yeah. Well, okay.
Um,
I think and I know you didn't actually introduce. this
Hi,
is
I'm
a
Sam.
this is a great introduction where we didn't actually introduce Sam, and I don't know that I've ever really introduced myself other than saying, "Hey, I come at things from a biblical Christian worldview, or at least I attempt to as best as I can." So, um, everybody, this is Sam.
Yep.
Sam, when did you graduate from Knox?
Oh, last year,
Okay,
or the end of 2021, actually.
okay. So the
Yeah,
end of
because I finished at
2021.
the middle of the semester, whatever.
I
Yeah.
think, and I don't remember when I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, it was before
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
And pastor in Middle California. I don't know how much
Mm-hmm.
more you want to say there, but
The
feel free
exact
to fill in the.
center. The exact center. Don't cut us short. Yeah, I've pastored. I have a kind of a unique privilege and perspective. I'm pastoring the church that I grew up in. So I've
That's cool.
attended the same church since, like, preschool, toddler age, and grew up in this church. And then I've been the pastor of this church
Wow.
for a little over 11 years now.
Wow.
Um,
Wow. And
so
if
yeah,
you've never met Sam before, he is 23, and so yeah, he started all
I
this really early.
really, really young. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was oh man.
That's
Yeah, I
cool, man.
started.
That's
I did start. I did start pastoring. I was 22.
okay.
I was
Yeah,
22, and looked not quite. I wish I had
14.
looked as old as 22 at the time. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Keep the
But
beard. Keep the beard. You're
yeah,
doing great.
it's required. I think at this point. Yeah, I don't
Um,
go back.
dude, that is wonderful. Your story is so different from mine because I'm a missionary and moved around,
Mhm.
and even having finished initially the service that I did as a missionary,
Mhm.
very much felt called as a missionary to Northern California or North America, called kind of back to my own people, and then I moved like a million times, like in the time that I got married to the time that we had our third kid. I think we moved
Yeah.
13 times. I think at
Oh,
one point my wife and I had 5 different jobs at the same time. I was going to school. It's just been crazy. So even though we kind of we're coming at this from two very different
yeah,
stories, it sounds like, I guess,
yeah, yeah.
which is still kind of cool. That again goes back to, and this is going to go into the Jordan Peterson thing, but what is it that brings people together? What is it that allows there to
Hmm.
be unity in the midst of diversity in a huge
Hmm.
community, and maybe even globally? I feel like I just stepped into a Dr. Seuss book, but yeah, the only thing in my mind that is powerful enough to do that is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
That that's, and again, that's why these conversations are important and the stakes are kind of high in a sense, because we are ultimately talking about life and death and eternity and who we are. And you had touched on this a little bit earlier, but just even as I go through life, how do I do that in a way that's worshipful? That is like I live my life as an act of worship to the Creator. There's a community of people out here that want to engage in these types of meaningful conversations. There's a lot out there. So the fact that you have spent your time with us is valuable. I really appreciate it. And if you have gotten value out of this discussion, and if you haven't subscribed, I would just ask you to subscribe. If you already have subscribed, I would ask you to find somebody you think who could benefit from this and share it with that person. You don't get a whole lot of traction on YouTube and places like that. If you're listening to this on a podcast, find the YouTube video, hit the like button, share it with a friend. And really that way the community can generate more and more meaningful conversation rather than just doom scrolling the internet, So I appreciate that you're here at the end of this video. And I, again, love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Pretty committed to this, and I want to make each video better and better and better. The more I do it, the more I learn. And so even though it's more of a podcast style, there's not a lot of lights and flashy things. Hopefully the quality is the quality matches the content. Hopefully. We'll see. That's my goal. That's the goal there, is that the quality would match the content. So thank you for being here and helping me do that.